Black Fisherman pulls a strange container from the ocean. What he saw changed his life. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video. He was just a fisherman who, by chance, dredged a large container from the ocean's depths. The sun had only just started to crest the horizon over the small coastal town as Darius Cole stood on the weathered planks of the old pier, his gaze fixed on the endless gray expanse of the water. A briny wind whipped at his face, carrying the familiar smells of salt and seaweed. His boat, a durable but aging vessel he called Big Mama's Grace, bobbed gently on its mooring lines. Its once vibrant blue paint was peeling, yet it remained a dependable craft. With hands accustomed to the work, Darius tugged on the ropes, inspecting the knots as he did every morning, his thoughts already weighed down by the prospect of another demanding day at sea. The town at his back was quiet, still moving to the unhurried rhythm of dawn. Modest homes with worn siding and corrugated roofs hugged the shoreline, their windows dark save for the faint glow from a few early risers. This was a place often overlooked by maps, a sliver of land where existence was governed by the tides and the unyielding spirit of the families who stayed. Darius was raised here, spent years away working on cargo ships, and came back after his wife passed to raise his daughter, Zara, on his own. He was a different man back then, more robust in both body and soul. Now, at 42, his shoulders carried the ache of years spent hauling nets, his hands were tough and scarred, and a quiet exhaustion born from relentless work and mounting bills settled in his eyes. He looked up at the sky with a frown. The weather had been fickle lately. The previous night's radio forecast had mentioned unstable conditions offshore, but he couldn't afford to wait for tranquil seas. The nearby fishing areas were depleted, and his most recent haul had hardly paid for fuel. He needed a bigger, better catch, something valuable enough to ensure there was food on their table and to quiet the nagging calls from creditors who were starting to circle. His attention shifted out toward the ocean, to the deeper waters far beyond where the local fishermen typically ventured. Those parts of the sea had a certain notoriety. The currents were treacherous, and eerie tales were attached to those depths. Stories of sunken vessels, ships that disappeared without a trace, and sonar that returned only garbled echoes. Darius wasn't one for ghost stories, but he respected danger. He'd worked those waters before and knew that while they could easily claim a careless man, they also held the promise of a much more bountiful catch. An image of Zara flashed in his mind as he secured the final knot. She was 13 now, sharp and resilient, and old enough to grasp their financial strain. Her school fees were late, and she had ceased asking for new clothes or toys months ago. He despised the look she got when she saw him counting change at the kitchen table late at night, the quiet resignation of a child who learned too young how precarious their situation was. That was the reason he was pushing farther out than ever before. He could sense it deep in his gut. It was a risk he had to take. The pier groaned beneath his boots as he boarded his boat and fired up the engine. Its familiar grumble was a comfort, a sound that reminded him of countless hours navigating these waters. He untied the mooring lines, nudged the throttle forward, and felt the vessel pull away from the dock, cutting through the murky water as the town faded into a blur against the coast. The sky was still overcast, painted with subdued shades of orange and pink, but the horizon before him was shrouded in a foreboding haze that seemed to consume everything. Hours ticked by as Darius piloted Big Mama's Grace into deeper territory. The shoreline disappeared, leaving only the rolling ocean stretching in all directions. The waves swelled, lifting and dropping his boat in a slow, unending rhythm as gulls circled and cried out before gliding away to the east. He corrected his course, aiming for a sector he recalled from years past, a spot most avoided. Few fishermen ventured there now, deterred by the strong currents and the way sonar equipment would sometimes mysteriously fail, but Darius remembered it as a place teeming with fish. By late morning, he had arrived. He throttled the engine down to an idle and surveyed his surroundings. There were no other boats, just an unbroken expanse of water. The solitude was immense, a feeling that reminded a man of his own insignificance out here. He started preparing his gear with the fluid efficiency of long experience, checking the winch, examining the trawl net for any rips, and arranging ropes neatly on the deck. Once everything was set, he positioned the boat against the wind, activated the hydraulic system, and sent the net plunging into the water. The net sank with a steady, rhythmic unspooling as Darius monitored the depth gauge, 50 feet, 100, 200, down into the darker strait of the sea where sunlight struggled to penetrate. When the line went slack, he locked it and set the winch to hold. Then came the wait. Darius leaned on the rail, watching the restless surface. He had always seen the sea as a living entity, temperamental and wild, beautiful one moment and deadly the next. Hours passed. His stomach rumbled, but he paid it no mind, his eyes constantly scanning for any indication of a catch. The boat rocked steadily, the soft creaking of wood and the distant sound of waves being the only companions to his solitude. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that the winch shuddered with a sudden, violent jolt. Darius snapped to attention as the steel cable went taut, groaning under an immense strain. The boat was pulled sideways, dragged off its position. His initial thought was a massive school of fish, perhaps a heavy cluster of tuna, caught along the ocean floor. He reached for the controls, gently engaging the hydraulic lever to begin reeling it in. The winch labored, the drum turning with a sluggish protest against every foot of line. Then another lurch, more powerful this time. The bow dipped precariously close to the water before righting itself, and Darius felt a cold surge of adrenaline. He cut the throttle, braced himself against the tilting deck, and stared at the straining cable. This was no typical haul. It felt as if he had hooked the very seabed. He tried putting the boat in a slight reverse to free the snag, but the tension only intensified. The engine roared, fighting the pull. Sweat formed on his forehead as he throttled back once more, his fingers clutching the winch controls. He considered slicing the line. Losing the net was preferable to capsizing. But then, with a slow, eerie groan, the cable began to move. Inch by painstaking inch, whatever was down there started to ascend. Darius peered over the side, his heart pounding, and caught the first glint of metal breaking the surface far below, dark and slick with seawater. As more of it surfaced, his breath hitched. This was not debris. It was not a fragment from a shipwreck or discarded fishing gear. It was smooth, geometric, and clearly manufactured. By the time the object was high enough to be seen clearly, Darius was looking at the unmistakable corner of a massive shipping container. Its sides were pristine, its paint barely touched, and strange symbols were etched along its surface. Markings he did not recognize, nothing like the standard stencil company logos he was used to seeing on cargo docks. The truth of the situation struck him. How could something of this size end up at this depth? And more importantly, how had it remained so untouched? His grip on the controls tightened. Whatever this was, it was not ordinary salvage. It was heavier than anything he had ever hoisted, but a powerful curiosity had taken hold of him. He reset the winch, locked the gears, and committed to bringing it all the way up. The boat groaned under the immense weight, and the waves slapped more forcefully now as the clouds overhead grew thicker. Darius worked systematically, drenched in sweat as he stabilized the vessel, ran additional lines, and rigged the old buoyancy pontoons he kept for unusually large catches. Every muscle in his body burned as he fought against the sea and the unyielding weight on his line. Hours crept by. The horizon grew dim. At last, after an agonizing struggle, the container broke free from the depths completely, its surface gleaming in the fading light like a resurrected relic. Darius stared at it, soaked and spent, as the ocean swelled and sighed around him. He didn't know it yet, but this find was about to alter the course of his life. The container loomed behind Darius's boat like a dark obelisk, secured tightly to the buoyancy pontoons he had wrestled to attach. Every surge of the sea threatened to tear it loose, and the cables moaned like living creatures under the immense pressure. The sky had faded to a leaden gray, and the gentle sea chop had transformed into sharp, rolling waves that crashed against the hull. The storm Darius had been wary of all morning was closing in, its winds tasting the edges of his small world, pushing him to move faster. His arms were sore from hours of intense work, but he didn't dare relax his hold on the controls. Each tiny adjustment demanded focus. One wrong move, and the entire load could shift or break away. The old winch shrieked in protest, and he muttered a soft curse, coaxing the engine forward in controlled bursts. Big Mama's Grace was never designed for this kind of work, a fact Darius knew all too well. Yet, a stubborn part of him refused to let go of what he had fought so hard to raise from the ocean floor. He had looked at that unnatural object for too long to leave it behind now. Its appearance was unsettling, yet it held a strange fascination for him. The container was unlike any he had ever encountered. Its metal walls showed no rust, no barnacles, no evidence of the sea's typical claim over submerged objects. Water ran down its sides in thin streams, but underneath, the surface had a faint sheen, as if preserved by some impossible force. The markings on its panels were in no language Darius could identify. There were no shipping codes, no familiar stenciled letters from the cargo companies he once worked for, only stark, geometric symbols that seemed intentionally etched deep into the metal. He kept his eyes fixed on it as he navigated his boat back toward the coast. The strain was unceasing. Twice, waves slammed into the starboard side with enough force to drench him in icy spray, soaking his jacket through. His hands grew numb from gripping the throttle and controls, but he kept going. He thought of Zara back home, probably at the kitchen table with her school books, waiting for his return. This thing, whatever it was, felt like the type of discovery that could turn their lives around. Even if it held no monetary value, someone would surely pay for information about it. When the shoreline finally appeared, Darius released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The familiar sight of the dock and the cluster of weathered buildings was a comforting anchor, pulling him towards safety. The storm front was on his heels, its clouds forming an ominous wall on the horizon, but he was close enough to make it. With careful maneuvering, he guided the boat toward the sheltered cove by his mooring, battling the wind until he slipped into the calmer waters near the pier. He secured the container to a pair of old floating pontoons he kept tethered there for temporary storage, then tied his boat securely. For a long moment, he just stood on the deck, breathing heavily, staring at the massive object floating gently beside him. In the dim light of dusk, it looked even more alien. No seaweed clung to it. No dents marred its corners, despite what must have been years under immense pressure. It was perfectly intact, sealed completely shut, and utterly silent. Darius climbed onto the dock, his boots thudding against the wood. He grabbed the thick mooring ropes and fastened the pontoons firmly to keep the container from drifting. His mind was racing. He had salvaged things before, scrap metal, broken crates, even an old fishing trawler, but never anything like this. This was not some forgotten cargo lost in a storm. It felt like it had been hidden, intentionally left behind. He retrieved a crowbar and his heavy bolt cutters from a storage shed by the pier, the tools feeling unusually heavy in his hands. The storm winds whipped at his back, urging him on, but his actions were measured and deliberate. He walked around the container, examining it from every angle. There was no obvious indication of how it sank, no signs of a collision, no damage that would suggest it had fallen from a ship. The seals around the doors were thick and seamless, designed for complete water resistance. The locking mechanism was peculiar, unlike any he had seen. It wasn't a simple padlock or even a standard heavy-duty latch. This was a reinforced system, its metal housing recessed into the door with no visible branding or identifying marks. He knelt, running his fingers over its cold surface, tracing the faint grooves around it. It reminded him of something military-grade, the kind of hardware he'd only glimpsed from a distance in naval ports. He paused, leaning back on his heels, listening to the wind howl through the pier's pilings. Something about this felt profoundly wrong. Salvage laws were clear enough. Finders keepers if the owner couldn't be identified. But this didn't feel like it belonged to someone who would accept its loss quietly. Still, he couldn't stop now. He'd brought it this far. He braced himself, clamped the jaws of the bolt cutters around the lock, and squeezed with all his might. The thick steel fought back for a moment, then yielded with a sharp, metallic snap that echoed across the deserted pier. The lock dropped to the ground with a dull clang. Darius stood up, his heart thumping, and gripped the heavy handles of the container doors. They were stiff, sealed tight from years of neglect, and it took several grunting efforts before they finally gave way. The rubber seals hissed as they broke, and the doors creaked open inch by inch. He stepped back on instinct, preparing for the stench of seawater or the sight of ruined cargo. But there was nothing. No water gushed out. No debris fell. Instead, a rush of dry, stale air and a darkness so profound it felt unnatural greeted him. He blinked, disoriented, before fumbling for the flashlight on his belt. Its beam pierced the gloom, revealing a sight that made him freeze. Inside was not a cargo hold filled with crates or machinery. He was looking into what could only be described as a room, a living space, eerily preserved. A bed was bolted to one wall, made up as if its occupant had just stepped out. A small table and 2 chairs stood nearby. Shelves on another wall were stacked with books and sealed containers. The floor was covered with a thin but undamaged rug, and on one side, faded drawings were taped up, childlike sketches of suns, houses, and smiling figures. Darius moved closer, shining the light around the space. The walls were reinforced and insulated. A small metal locker stood in the corner, its door slightly open, revealing neatly folded clothes. A framed photograph rested on the table, showing a black man, a woman, and 2 small children, their smiles frozen in time. The most unsettling part was how untouched it all was. There was no sign of flooding, no mold, no decay. It was as if this place had been perfectly sealed, waiting. Darius swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. His fingers trembled as he reached out to touch the table's edge. The wood was smooth and dry. It was impossible. Containers didn't survive like this at the bottom of the ocean. They didn't contain furnished rooms. He backed away slowly, the wind outside howling louder now. Night was falling quickly, and the first drops of rain began to splatter against the pier. He pulled the doors closed again, securing them with a length of chain. His flashlight flickered, and he cast one last look at the massive object beside the dock, its shadows clinging to it like something alive. As he trudged back toward his house through the building storm, Darius couldn't escape the feeling that he had unearthed something that was never meant to be found. The storm raged against the small coastal town through the night and into the early morning. Rain beat against the windows of Darius's small house, and the wind howled like a tormented spirit, rattling the walls and shaking the loose shingles on the roof. Darius lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind refusing to quiet down. The image of the container's interior replayed in his thoughts. The perfectly made bed, the shelves of books, the drawings clearly made by a child. It felt less like a salvaged discovery and more like he had opened a door into a strange, frozen moment of someone else's life. When dawn finally broke, it was shrouded in low gray clouds and a pale, colorless light that turned the sea into a sheet of steel. Darius got up early, his body aching with fatigue, but his mind agitated. He made coffee in silence, his eyes fixed on the distant pier where the container sat tethered to its pontoons, a dark and silent shape against the shifting tide. The storm had passed, leaving a hush in its wake. But he couldn't shake the sense that something fundamental had shifted, as if the very air was holding its breath. Zara began to stir in her room across the hall, but Darius left her to sleep. He scrawled a quick note on the kitchen table. Asterisk back by noon. Stay inside. Do your homework asterisk, and pulled on his heavy boots and jacket. The smell of salt and wet earth met him as he stepped outside. The streets were slick with rainwater, and puddles reflected the dim morning light. He walked briskly toward the pier, each step bringing him closer to the object that had invaded his dreams. The container appeared just as it had the previous evening, its angular form stark against the muted colors of the shore. Darius climbed down to the dock, the wood slick under his boots, and paused to study it in the daylight. The symbols etched into its surface were clearer now, though no more understandable. Sharp lines and intersecting curves that resembled no language he knew. A shiver ran down his spine, even in the still air. He approached the doors, unwound the chain he had hastily secured the night before, and pulled them open again. The hinges gave a faint creak of protest, but the seals maintained their strange integrity, releasing only a slight puff of dry air as they parted. Darius stepped inside cautiously, his flashlight beam cutting across the interior, though the pale morning light now filtered in from behind. Everything was exactly as he had left it, undisturbed and impossibly preserved. He crossed the threshold completely this time, his boots making a soft thud on the carpeted floor. The feeling was surreal, walking into what felt like someone's home, perfectly preserved at the bottom of the sea. He began to inspect the space more carefully. The bed was made with a thin blanket pulled taut and tucked in with a precision that suggested routine. On the table beside it were a small metal cup, a spoon, and a closed book with a worn cover. He picked it up and flipped through its pages. It was a collection of short stories in English, the paper yellowed with age. Underneath was another book, this one in a language he couldn't identify, its letters curling in ornate script. The shelves held dozens more books, some familiar manuals and novels, others entirely foreign. Interspersed among them were sealed plastic containers, each labeled in neat handwriting. Rice, dried beans, salted meat, medical supplies. The air held the faint scent of old paper and dust, not mold or seawater. Darius knelt by one of the storage boxes, pried it open, and found vacuum-sealed food packets, all perfectly intact despite years of submersion. Then his gaze landed on the drawings. He approached them slowly, a tightness in his chest. They were simple crayon sketches on plain white paper, taped to the metal walls. A smiling sun, a blue house with smoke curling from its chimney, a stick-figure family holding hands. One figure, a tall, broad-shouldered man, was drawn with particular care, his face marked with black dots for eyes and a bold red smile. Next to the drawings was a photograph pinned to the wall. Darius gently took it down. It showed the same black man from the drawing, standing on a sandy beach with a woman and two children. They were laughing, the wind catching their clothes, the ocean a brilliant blue behind them. The man's arm was wrapped protectively around the woman, while the children held onto their parents, their faces bright with happiness. Darius stared at it for a long moment, an unexpected knot forming in his throat. Placing the photo back, he moved to the small locker in the corner. Its door was ajar, and inside were neatly folded clothes, plain shirts, sturdy pants, undergarments, all sealed in plastic to keep them dry. He lifted one of the packages and saw how carefully it had been wrapped, as if the person who did it knew they wouldn't be able to tend to it again for a very long time. In the far corner, he saw a low metal chest bolted to the floor. Its surface was scratched, but undamaged. When he knelt and opened it, he found a collection of compact, neatly organized items, tools, spare parts for equipment he didn't recognize, and a small handheld device in a clear waterproof bag. Darius carefully removed it. It was an old portable recorder, its casing scuffed but whole. He worked at the bag seal until he could slide the device free. Turning it over, he saw a label on the back with a date from over a decade ago. His pulse quickened as he pressed the power button. To his amazement, the device came to life, its screen glowing faintly. A single audio file blinked on the display. With only a moment's hesitation, he pressed play. At first, there was only static and a low hum, punctuated by the faint groan of metal and muffled sounds that could have been distant voices. Then, a man's voice, accented but clear, cut through, strained and urgent. "My name is Kwame Diallo," it said. "If anyone finds this, please, you must listen. We don't have much time." Darius froze, his hand gripping the recorder. The voice continued, rapid and panicked. "We were promised safety, a new life, but it was a lie. They brought us aboard and locked us in these containers. We worked under guard. No sunlight, no freedom. Some of us have been here for years." A pause, then a sound like someone shifting in the background. "If you're hearing this, I am gone, or I will be soon." They threw my container overboard to silence me. The message faltered, static consuming a few words before it returned. The ship is still out there. People need help. Lives are at stake. The coordinates, they are. The numbers were sharp and precise, burning into Darius's memory just as the recording crackled and died. Silence filled the room once more. Darius stared at the recorder, his heart hammering. He replayed the coordinates in his head. He knew that area. It was deep water, a stretch of open sea far from normal shipping routes, known for strange reports and sonar glitches. He set the recorder down and looked around the room again, at the picture of the smiling family, the sealed food, the carefully prepared supplies. Whoever Kwame Diallo was, he had lived here, trapped beneath the ocean, and had died leaving this message behind. A chill ran through him. This was no ordinary salvage. This was evidence of something far darker, something that was still happening. He backed out of the container, nearly bumping the table, his gaze lingering on the photograph one last time before he turned toward the open doors. Outside, the sky was still heavy with clouds, and the wind was picking up again, carrying the scent of the sea and the hint of more rain. He knew what he had to do. He would go to those coordinates. He had to see for himself what was out there, even if it meant sailing farther from shore than he ever had before. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished, and he was already entangled in it. Darius stood at the edge of the pier for a long time after leaving the container, staring out at the gray horizon where the sea and clouds met. The wind tugged at his jacket, and the sharp scent of salt filled his lungs. His fingers still had a faint tremor from holding the recorder, Kwame Diallo's words echoing in his mind. Coordinates, a plea for help, a ship still lurking in that vast expanse of water. He knew he should go straight to the authorities, but a deep instinct told him there was no time to waste. If what Diallo said was true, lives were on the line, and every hour counted. He returned home with a heavy heart. Zara was at the kitchen table, her hair in a messy braid, her homework spread out before her. She looked up when he entered, her expression curious but wary, as if she could sense the storm still raging inside him. Darius forced a smile for her, saying nothing of his discovery as he made her breakfast. His movements were automated, his mind a world away. He told her only that he had to make another trip out on the water and might be back late. She frowned but didn't protest, accustomed to his long days. For that, he felt both relief and a pang of guilt. After dropping Zara with a neighbor who often watched her, Darius went back to the pier. The tide was coming in, lapping at the posts. The container sat motionless, chained where he had left it, a dark sentinel on the water. He gave a passing glance, but didn't stop. His focus was on preparing Big Mama's Grace for the longest voyage it had undertaken in years. He checked the fuel drums, topped them off from his reserves, and loaded extra supplies: water, food, flares, and a spare fuel canister. He worked with a grim determination. The sea was calm when he set out, but Darius knew it wouldn't last. He steered his boat into open water, guided by the GPS coordinates from Diallo's recording. The steady hum of the engine vibrated through the deck. He kept glancing back at the shoreline until it shrank to a faint line and then disappeared entirely. Soon, there was only water in every direction, an endless, shifting desert of gray waves and sky. Time became a blur as he pushed farther out. The clouds shifted, the sunlight dimmed, and the wind began to pick up, creating ripples on the water surface. The isolation grew more intense with every mile. Out here, there was no margin for error. The sea was indifferent, and if something went wrong, no one would hear his calls. He gripped the wheel tighter, his jaw set. The GPS signaled he was approaching the location. Darius slowed the engine and scanned the horizon. For a long while, he saw nothing but empty ocean. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. Maybe it was a fool's errand. Maybe whatever Diallo had described was long gone. Then he saw it. At first, just a faint smudge against the horizon, almost lost in the haze. As he got closer, the shape resolved into the outline of a massive vessel, sitting unnaturally still. Its hull was dark and streaked with rust, and its towering cranes were like skeletal arms frozen in place. No flags flew from its masts, and there was no sign of activity on its decks. Yet Darius's gut told him the ship was not abandoned. He cut the engine to a low idle and drifted closer, his heart pounding. Through his binoculars, he studied the ship. The name on its bow had been crudely painted over, as if to erase its identity. The portholes were dark, and a strange stillness hung about the vessel, as though it had been left to rot, yet remained functional. Darius hesitated. Every rational thought screamed at him to turn back and report this. But another part of him, the stubborn, restless part, pushed him forward. He adjusted his course and crept closer, the low rumble of his engine lost in the vastness of the sea. Suddenly, there was movement from behind the ship's hulking form. Two smaller, sleeker boats appeared, their engines roaring to life as they sliced through the water toward him. They were painted black, with no markings or flags, and they were alarmingly fast. Darius's heart seized. They were coming for him. He spun the wheel hard, jamming the throttle forward. Big Mama's Grace surged ahead, its engine groaning. Behind him, the two boats gave chase, their bows cutting through the waves. He glanced over his shoulder, his hands gripping the wheel with white-knuckled intensity as adrenaline coursed through him. The sea was getting rougher, the wind rising. He pushed the engine to its limit, steering toward a bank of low, rolling fog ahead. It was his only hope. If he could lose them in the mist, he might escape. Spray lashed his face as he plunged into the fog. Visibility dropped to near zero, the world becoming a swirl of gray. He cut the engine abruptly, letting his momentum carry him forward in silence. His own ragged breathing was loud in his ears. He could hear the distant roar of the pursuing boats, muffled and uncertain. For what felt like an eternity, he drifted in the gloom, the sea slapping gently against the hull. Then, slowly, the sound of the engines faded. The silence was sudden and profound. Darius exhaled, his fingers trembling on the wheel. He waited, likely no more than 10 minutes, before daring to restart the engine at a whisper-quiet throttle. He turned the boat in a wide arc, staying at the edge of the fog bank, and set a course back to shore. His nerves were frayed, his body tense. But beneath the fear was a grim certainty. Diallo was telling the truth. The ship was real, and its operators did not want to be found. His near capture solidified what he already suspected. This was no simple salvage mystery. It was something dark and dangerous, and it wouldn't just disappear. By the time he saw the faint outline of the coast again, the sun was low, painting the sky in pale gold and muted violet. He piloted his boat back into the harbor slowly, checking for any sign of pursuit, but saw none. The town was quiet, as if nothing had happened. Yet Darius knew better. He secured Big Mama's Grace at the pier, his movements automatic, his mind racing. The container was still there, silent and foreboding, but he barely looked at it. He knew his next step. This was beyond him now. That night, after tucking Zara into bed, Darius sat at the kitchen table long past midnight, staring at the recorder and the coordinates he had scribbled down. He would go to the authorities. He would tell them everything. And this time, he wouldn't stop until someone listened. The next morning broke heavy and still, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Darius sat on the edge of his bed, lacing his boots with slow, deliberate movements, his mind settled on the decision he had made during the long night. The faint sounds of Zara in the kitchen drifted through the house, a reminder of the world he had to protect, even as he was drawn toward a danger greater than any he had ever known. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and stepped quietly into the cool morning air, the door closing softly behind him. The walk to the regional office of the coastal authorities took him through the familiar streets of his town. Fellow fishermen were hosing down their boats, gulls cried overhead, and the scent of brine hung in the air. To anyone else, it was just another day. But for Darius, every detail felt heightened, as if he were seeing it one last time before his life changed forever. Inside the office, the air smelled of stale coffee amid the low hum of radios. He approached the front desk, where a young officer in a crisp uniform looked up from his paperwork with polite disinterest. Darius explained who he was and asked to speak to someone in charge. The urgency in his voice was enough for the officer to lead him to a back room, where a senior official, a stern-looking black man named Captain Elijah Brooks, waited with an expression of ingrained skepticism. Darius laid out the entire story: the coordinates, the container, the recording from Kwame Diallo, and the massive ship. He described the boats that had chased him, the erased markings on the hull, and the vessel's eerie stillness. He placed the recorder on the table and played the message, watching the captain's face as Diallo's strained voice filled the small room. When the recording ended, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The skepticism in Captain Brooks's eyes was gone, replaced by a hard, calculating focus. "You understand the implications of what you're saying?" Brooks asked, his voice low. It was not a question. Darius nodded, his jaw firm. He understood completely. Within an hour, the office was a hive of activity. Radios crackled, maps were spread across the table, and a small tactical team assembled in full gear. Captain Brooks told Darius they had been tracking vague reports of illegal shipping in that area for months, but lacked solid evidence. His account and the recorder were the missing pieces. Darius found himself swept up in their preparations. He wasn't ordered to join, but when Brooks asked if he could guide them to the ship's exact location, Darius agreed without a second thought. He felt a responsibility for what he had found, and though a part of him dreaded returning, he couldn't turn away. By midday, Darius was back aboard Big Mama's Grace, this time flanked by 2 patrol boats bristling with armed officers. The contrast was surreal. His weathered fishing boat, scarred by years of hard work, sailing alongside sleek government craft with advanced radar and reinforced hulls. The sky had cleared, and sunlight glinted sharply off the water. The journey out was silent, but charged with tension. Darius remained at the helm of his boat, leading the small convoy toward the coordinates etched in his memory. The sea was unusually calm until that same distant smudge appeared on the horizon, growing clearer with each passing minute. When the ship loomed into full view, even the experienced officers on the patrol boats fell silent. It was just as Darius had described, a towering vessel adrift on the open sea, its hull dark and weathered, its cranes frozen. No signal lights, no flag, no visible activity. It could have been mistaken for a derelict ship if not for the subtle signs of life Darius pointed out, shadowy figures moving on deck, quickly ducking out of sight. Captain Brooks ordered the patrol boats to hold their position while they assessed the situation. Through binoculars, Darius could see the hidden vigilance on the ship. Figures clustered near the railings, others slipped between container stacks. This was no ghost ship. The decision was made quickly. Using loudspeakers, the authorities announced themselves, their demands sharp and clear. Cut your engines, prepare for inspection, comply peacefully. For several long seconds, there was only the sound of waves against the hulls. Then, without warning, the ship erupted with activity. A handful of armed men appeared on deck, shouting. One fired a warning shot into the air, the crack echoing across the water. What followed was swift. The patrol boats surged forward as Captain Brooks barked orders over the radio. Officers aimed their weapons as they closed the distance. Grappling lines flew, and in moments, the first boarding teams were scaling the hull, disappearing over the railings. Darius stayed back, his boat circling at a safe distance, his hands gripping the rail so tightly his knuckles were white. He could see little beyond the ship's deck, catching only fragments of the chaos over the radio. Muffled shouts, boots pounding on metal, the crackle of commands. Then he heard something else. Voices, dozens of them, raw and desperate, rising like a wave of anguish. When Captain Brooks's voice finally came through, it carried a weight that seemed to quiet the sea itself. "We found them," he said simply. Minutes later, the full truth emerged. Officers began guiding people onto the deck, men, women, and even some children. They came out of the ship's cavernous interior in a slow, staggering procession, their faces gaunt, their clothes in tatters. Some shielded their eyes from the bright sun as if they hadn't seen it in years. Others clung to each other, trembling and silent. Something twisted deep inside Darius. He recognized the haunted look of those who had survived by enduring the unthinkable. They were led gently to the waiting patrol boats, where medics rushed to help them. There were so many more than he had imagined. Among them, a man with sharp, weary eyes caught Darius's gaze. He looked just like the man from the photograph, though thinner now, his hair streaked with gray. When their eyes met, the man hesitated, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of recognition before being led to safety. The officers swept through the ship, rounding up those who had resisted. Captain Brooks reported that several crew members were in custody. Their operation had uncovered a floating prison disguised as a cargo ship, where captives were forced into labor, their container homes hidden from the world. Darius exhaled slowly, his hands trembling. The sea around them felt different now, alive with voices, engines, and radios. It was over, or at least this part was. As the last of the freed captives were transferred, Captain Brooks approached Darius. His face was grim but resolute. "You did the right thing," he said. "Without you, we might never have found them." Darius nodded mutely, his gaze drifting to the ship one last time. Its dark hull seemed less menacing now, its secrets exposed. He wondered how many other ships like it still roamed the seas, unseen. The convoy turned back toward shore as the sun dipped low, casting a warm glow over the water. Darius followed in their wake, his boat dwarfed by the patrol craft, but somehow at the center of it all. The air smelled of salt and fuel, now tinged with something else, a faint current of relief, of something broken finally being mended. When the coastline came into view, lit by the golden fire of dusk, Darius thought of Zara waiting at home, unaware of what her father had done. He resolved to tell her soon. As he moored his boat and stepped onto the dock, exhausted but steady, Darius understood something with newfound clarity. The ocean held its secrets, dark and deep. But this time, he had pulled one into the light, and in doing so, he had changed more than just his own life. The harbor had never been so full. When Darius returned, trailing the patrol boats carrying the rescued captives and their captors, it seemed the entire town had gathered at the docks. Word had spread like wildfire, and curious faces pressed in, their voices a mixture of confusion and awe. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to get a better look, while fishermen and townsfolk murmured amongst themselves, pointing at the strange procession entering the port. The setting sun stained the water a deep copper as the first patrol boat docked and officers began to help their passengers disembark. Darius stayed near his boat, gripping the railing as he watched the first of the rescued people step onto solid ground. Their movements were slow, uncertain, as if they expected the planks beneath them to disappear. Medics hurried forward, wrapping blankets around shivering shoulders and guiding them toward makeshift tents set up along the pier. The authorities worked swiftly, managing the crowd and their charges. Cries of reunited families began to rise from the chaos. People who had lost hope now clinging to their loved ones. Darius saw the man he recognized from the photograph, Kwame Diallo himself. His face was gaunt and his eyes were shadowed, but a new light shone in them. Their gazes met across the crowd, and Kwame gave a nod that conveyed gratitude, acknowledgement, and a profound relief. The authorities moved the survivors indoors, where food, clothing, and cots awaited. News crews arrived soon after, their cameras flashing and microphones aimed at anyone in uniform. Darius kept to the fringes, silent and unnoticed, just as he preferred. He wasn't there for recognition. He was there to witness the culmination of what he had started. Captain Brooks found him eventually, his stride purposeful, his face weary but determined. He put a hand on Darius's shoulder and led him away from the crowd to the quieter end of the pier. "What we found," Brooks began, his voice low and steady, "was worse than any of us imagined. That ship was a floating prison run by a network we've been chasing for years. Human trafficking, forced labor, people taken from their homes and vanished." He paused, looking at Darius. "Your container, the one you pulled up, was from that ship. They must have dumped it to silence Diallo. If you hadn't found it." His voice trailed off, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Darius stared at the horizon, his jaw tight. He knew it was bad, but hearing it spelled out so plainly felt like a physical weight. Brooks continued, explaining that the captured crew would be interrogated and that international agencies were already mobilizing to track down the rest of the operation. "You gave us the lead we needed," Brooks said. "It's going to take time, but we'll dismantle this entire network." When Darius finally returned home that evening, the sun had set completely. His body ached with exhaustion, and his mind felt raw from the day's events. Zara was at the kitchen table, her chin resting in her hands, a book forgotten before her. When he walked in, she leaped up and threw her arms around him with a force that almost knocked the breath out of him. "You were gone forever," she said into his chest, her voice shaky. "I know," Darius murmured, holding her tight, grounding himself in her presence. He told her only the basics, that he had helped rescue some people, that the authorities were handling it, and that it was over. She studied his face with wide eyes but didn't ask for more details. For that, he was grateful. In the following days, the story became national news. Reporters descended on their quiet town, with headlines shouting about a floating prison and the hero fisherman who led authorities to it. Darius dodged the cameras and microphones whenever he could. He gave a single, brief interview, insisting he had only done what anyone would have. From a distance, he watched as the survivors received care. Many were transferred to shelters in the city, while aid groups worked to get them home. Some had been missing for years, their stories emerging in fragments. Tales of being lured from distant lands with promises of work, only to be locked away on a ship that never docked. Kwame Diallo sought Darius out before he left. They stood by the pier, the wind whipping at their jackets. Kwame was thinner than in his photo, but he stood with a quiet dignity. "I thought I would die in that container," he said softly, his accent rich. "When they threw it overboard, I thought that was the end. I never imagined someone would find it." His eyes met Darius's, steady and unwavering. "You didn't just save us. You gave us back our voices." Darius didn't know what to say. He simply offered his hand, and Kwame gripped it firmly in a silent exchange of understanding. As Kwame turned to join the others boarding buses for the city, Darius felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. The authorities were true to their word. In the weeks that followed, arrests spread like ripples from a stone thrown into the sea. Names appeared in the news: financiers, smugglers, corrupt officials, all linked to the ship Darius had found. His container became the key piece of evidence in a sprawling international investigation. Life in the town gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. The fishermen went back to their nets. The gulls cried overhead. But Darius knew things were different. Every time he passed the spot where the container had rested, he remembered the drawings on its walls and the sound of Kwame's desperate voice. One evening, standing alone at the edge of the dock, Darius let the sound of the sea wash over him. He thought of the dark, unknowable depths and the secrets they held. He had dragged one of those secrets into the light, but he knew the ocean was vast. He placed his hands on the worn wooden rail and took a long breath. Behind him, he heard Zara's laughter as she ran down the pier to join him, her footsteps light. He turned to greet her with a rare smile. For now, this was enough. The sea would keep its mysteries, but Darius Cole had rediscovered something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. As he stood there with his daughter, watching the horizon burn gold before nightfall, he knew that whatever came next, he would face it head-on, with the quiet resolve of a man who understood both the dangers and the rewards hidden in the deep.